And often the concerns were that the estimates on the revenues were more politically motivated to serve the budget needs. And as a result, a number of states, Michigan's one of them, moved the revenue estimating divisions, in fact, completely out of the budget office. That's why it's housed in Treasury now. At one point in time, it used to be housed within DMB. And the idea is to have essentially people that aren't involved as much with the political process say, here's the economy, here's how we think it'll affect revenues, here's the tax structure we have, here's what we think will be brought in. And the three principles that are involved are basically to make sure that everybody participates in it and has an agreement with it. And then that's treated essentially as a fixed amount, and that, for the January purpose, then serves for the basis of the governor's budget. So there really isn't that option to say, well, we think the economy is going to be better, and so that, that's kind of already been fixed.
So in many ways, the governor's state of the state address and she follows up in this case with a budget proposal is based on January numbers.
Yes.
What's happened though between January numbers of prediction and May predictions?
In the January forecast, we saw that the economy was beginning to slow down. The financial crises that had started up in August in the financial markets and credit markets. Of course, housing's been slowing down for quite a bit. We've also thought that the vehicle market would slow down. In the ensuing 5 months, in fact, actually, in terms of financial markets and credit markets in particular, within 3 weeks after we met, the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates 250 basis points. We had the bailout of Bear Stearns. It turned out things were much worse than most people were thinking in early January, and so that's been a big part of the revision.
And the national picture does affect Michigan?
Yes. Similarly, housing has continued to look bad. I can't say that our forecasts were particularly off on that, but it's a severe issue. But the combination of housing and the stuff in the credit markets has had a greater impact on consumption, or at least the worry has been. Now, for Michigan, it's had less of an impact, and I think that's been a bit of the doldrums we've had for a number of years. But we're largely making our forecasts on sales tax. Many other states are seeing substantial deviations from their forecasts, and we thought oil would largely stabilize. Instead, it's gone up $20, $30, $40 a barrel.
We're all feeling it, believe me.
And so a number of those factors have led us to believe that the economy would be even slower in 2008 and the first part of 2009 than we thought in January. And also, at the time, they had not passed the federal stimulus package. That has both some revenue implications, positive and negative for the state, and so we needed to incorporate those sorts of things. And we think, as a result of the stimulus, the third quarter of 2008, for instance, would not be as slow as we would have thought it, because people will have these rebate checks. But to the extent that it doesn't really kind of kick us out, it produces a good quarter, and some people talk about a little W in the slowdown, that you'd have a slowdown, the stimulus, and another slowdown to kind of relapse. But that's essentially the big change, as we see the national economy being slower. Auto sales are struggling more, housing struggling like we thought, and the financial markets look a lot worse than we thought.
And then there were some new initiatives in the legislature to provide what they thought might be a stimulus-type package, some tax credits for Hollywood filmmakers, and we're seeing that at least at first blush, the hit to our general fund is fairly substantial.
Yes.
That the new revenue that might be generated from filmmakers is not going to offset the cost to our general fund. That brings us to some of the refundable credits too, and we'll get into that in a minute. I want to speak to Howard a little bit because he's been very much involved with that. But at this point, what can you say about the general fund? What kind, if we followed the governor's recommendations, what would be the deficit in the general fund?
I must admit, I've forgotten the exact
Yeah.
numbers. I know our agency has prepared them. For '08, we are looking at some revisions, although there was an expected surplus, and that surplus is enough to cover the revisions in '08. We lowered the estimates for general fund about $360 million, I think it was, for '09. And that includes the effect of carrying over less from '08, as well as reduced revenues in '09. The easy way to think of it is about a third of the revision is the film credit package that you mentioned. Another third is the federal, and about a third of it then is the slower economy. That's kind of the, if you were to kind of decompose the
That'll
things,
work.
but it's, I believe it's around $360 million.
How about the school aid fund?
The school aid fund, I believe, is looking at 180 million. Is that right? 120, 100 and some million, I believe.
But what we're saying is that's if all things are even, and that the legislature doesn't review now with the new numbers and go into target setting and perhaps reduce some of the spending that was proposed in order to balance a budget, which we must do.
Yes.
As a proviso, I guess I'd like to say that I did not vote for those tax credits for the film industry, really very much concerned about the fact that it could create a hole in the general fund at a time when so many of our businesses, and that's going to be the segue into the next part that I want to mention, segue into our business sector, that so many small and medium-sized businesses that we have heard from since the passage of the Michigan business tax have seen some of their liability rise 100, 200, 300, 400% at a time that, you know, we're looking at giving away potentially $100 million to entice Hollywood filmmakers to come short-term here into Michigan. Those are policy questions, and I respect that, and there are differences of opinion. I respect that as well. But Howard, you and I and some others worked diligently on a new replacement for the single business tax. Mm-hmm. And the Michigan business tax that resulted was a compromise. We didn't get everything we wanted. You and I and some of my Republican senators worked diligently to try and be, I would say, fair and equitable to the small, mid-sized businesses. And we did accomplish some of that, but probably not enough. And so now we're hearing from those companies that are really feeling a new pinch at a time when our economy still begins to slow, and people with new taxes that they didn't anticipate, they tell us, well, we're going to have to lay off people, or we're going to maybe have to look at either closing shop or moving out of the state. The exact opposite of what we wanted to build and foster. So we determined that I would nominate a subgroup, a subcommittee of the Senate Finance Committee to listen to the concerns of businesses around the state. And that subcommittee consisted of Senator Mark Jansen, the chair that I appointed, Senator Judson Gilbert, and then on the Democratic side, the good senator from the Upper Peninsula, Senator Michael Perusi. Howard, tell us a little bit how these meetings have gone. Where have you been?
Well, our first meeting was in Grand Rapids. We've had pretty good turnout, about 100, 120 or so people. Pretty broad spectrum of business interests, so good input there. The next place we went was, I believe, Rochester, Michigan. We were at Oakland University, a fairly large crowd there as well. Then we went to Saginaw, Michigan, and we're at Saginaw Valley State University. Mm-hmm. Heard from a lot of small businesses, some CPAs in the mid-Michigan area. And then Monday of this week, we were up in Gaylord, Michigan. And we had further testimony from a lot of small business. And so that's where we've been. We've heard a lot of different feedback, and some of it positive. The positive feedback tends to be from the manufacturers who got lots of credits under the new MBT, and really the MBT was fashioned to a great extent to help the manufacturing sector.